The rain that night was the kind that did not ask permission. It came down in long, straight sheets, the kind that soaked through wool before a person had taken 3 steps out of a doorway. It turned the stone courtyard of Harrington Manor into a shallow river, and made the torches along the eastern wall sputter and hiss, as if even they were reluctant to keep burning. Susan Ferris stood in it. She stood just outside the tall parlor window, her dark cloak pulled tight across her shoulders, rainwater running in cold lines down her temples and dripping from the ends of her hair. Her face was pale, not the pale of sickness, not the pale of fear, the kind of pale that comes to a person's face after they have made a decision so final that the body itself goes quiet, as if it is saving every last bit of energy for what comes next. Inside, the chandeliers were blazing. Duke Donald was laughing a broad, easy laugh, the kind that fills a room and expects applause. He stood at the center of his own ballroom, glass raised, surrounded by the finest coats and gowns money could arrange, and at his side, draped in a crimson dress that caught the chandelier light like a warning, was Martha Gracia. Martha laughed at something Donald said. She touched his arm with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once been made to feel like a guest in a room she was claiming. Susan stood at the window for exactly 3 seconds. Not to cry. She had already done that 2 years ago, then 1 year ago, then 6 months ago, in smaller and smaller amounts, until she realized that the tears were doing nothing except giving Donald a reason to call her fragile. Not to beg. She had never begged. Not once. And she was not about to begin on a Tuesday evening in the rain. She stood there for 3 seconds because she was counting. She counted the guards she could see inside. She counted the distance from the parlor window to the east corridor. She counted, in her head, the steps between the east corridor and Donald's private study, and from there to the safe behind the portrait of his late father, and from there to the eastern gate. She had designed that gate's lock mechanism herself 4 years ago, when Donald had told her the old one was inefficient. She had never told him she kept a private release code. What no one at that party knew, what Donald himself could never quite bring himself to understand, because understanding it would have forced him to feel the full weight of what he had done, was that every military strategy bearing his seal, every diplomatic dispatch that made foreign ministers nervous, every taxation policy that the regional council praised as brilliant, had come from Susan, from a desk tucked in the corner of the third-floor library that Donald walked past without looking at, from ink-stained fingers that no one at dinner ever noticed, from a mind that had spent 6 years keeping a man in power who had spent 6 years pretending she did not exist. Susan turned from the window. Pressed against her chest, beneath the cloak, wrapped in oilskin to keep it safe from the rain, was a leather ledger. Inside that ledger was every strategy, every document, every original draft in her handwriting, with her marginal notes, bearing her analysis in the margins, every piece of proof that the brilliant Duke Donald was, at his core, a man who had borrowed someone else's mind and signed his own name to it. If Donald woke up tomorrow thinking he could simply find another wife to drain, he was about to find out what happened when the woman he had drained finally decided she was done being quiet. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. All right, thank you. Now let's get back to the story. 6 months before the night Susan walked into the rain, there was dinner. There are dinners, and then there are dinners. This was the second kind arranged not primarily for food or fellowship, but to demonstrate something. Duke Donald was demonstrating, as he often did at the long mahogany table in Harrington Manor's formal dining hall, that he was a man of consequence, and that consequence looked a certain way. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, candles arranged in strict geometric rows, and exactly the right people seated in exactly the right places. The right people that particular evening were Magistrate Harold Reed and his wife, Catherine, who had come down from the northern county seat. Reuben Gerke, Donald's senior military officer, a square-shouldered man with careful eyes and the habit of watching everything while appearing to watch nothing, and Martha Gracia, who was listed on the evening seating card as a family friend, which was the kind of description that fooled no one except the people who wanted to be fooled. Martha wore red. She always wore red at Donald's table. Susan had noticed, over the past 14 months, that Martha wore red specifically when she wanted to make a point without saying a word. Tonight the gown was deep crimson with gold trim along the neckline, and she sat to Donald's immediate right, which was Susan's chair, which had been Susan's chair for 6 years, and Martha occupied it with the ease of someone who had been practicing. Susan sat at the far end of the table. She wore gray high-necked, well-fitted, and quiet. There was a small ink stain on her right index finger that she had scrubbed it earlier in the afternoon and not quite removed. She had been working on the supply chain analysis for the Eastern Garrison, and the work had run long, as it always did when she was close to a conclusion she could see, but not yet fully reach. She had reached it at 2:30. She had written the conclusion on a clean sheet of paper, sealed it inside a plain envelope, and tucked it beneath Donald's study door before she went to change for dinner. He had not thanked her. He never did. But at dinner, not 20 minutes later, he was explaining the Eastern Garrison strategy to Magistrate Reed with the exact words she had written, using the exact framing she had chosen, pausing in exactly the places she had marked with a small dash to indicate where a speaker should breathe for effect. He was good at delivering her work. She would give him that. His voice was confident, and he had a way of tilting his chin slightly upward when he was making a point that made even sharp men in the room feel as though they were receiving information from someone of genuine authority. Reuben Gerke, seated midway down the table, was listening. Susan noticed that Reuben always listened differently than the other men, not to be entertained, but to assess. His eyes moved, very slightly, between Donald and some middle distance that Susan suspected was actually the place in his memory where he kept the facts he already knew, comparing them to what was being said now. She wondered, not for the first time, whether Reuben Gerke had ever done the arithmetic on who was actually doing Donald's thinking. Martha leaned toward Catherine Reed at one point during the second course and said something in a low voice that traveled just far enough. Something about gray being a color more suited to stone walls than to women. Catherine laughed at the polite, uncertain laugh of someone who was not sure if the remark was meant to be cruel and had decided the safest response was to treat it as a joke. Donald heard it. His smile widened slightly. He did not look down at the table. Susan set her fork down. She picked up her wine glass. She took a small, deliberate sip, and then she looked directly at Martha Gracia across the length of the table, and she smiled not a warm smile, not a wounded smile, but the precise, measured smile of someone who has just decided something important and is keeping it entirely to herself. Martha looked away first. Much later, after the guests had gone and Donald had disappeared to some part of the house that Susan was no longer invited to ask questions about, Catherine Reed said quietly to her husband as their carriage rolled away from the Manor gate, "Harold, did you watch the Duchess tonight?" "Briefly," the magistrate said. "She never raised her voice," Catherine said. "She never made a single scene. But I watched her face when that woman made her remark. And Harold," she paused. "She wasn't sad. She was calculating." The magistrate said nothing, but he did not disagree. What most people understand about power is only the visible part, the titles, the offices, the names signed at the bottom of important documents. What most people miss is the part that happens before any of that, the thinking, the drafting, the 3 in the morning with cold tea and a lamp that is running low on oil. Susan Ferris understood both parts very well. She had spent 6 years living in the second one and watching someone else collect credit for the first. She had not begun this way. In the early months of her marriage to Donald, she had offered her help with openly suggested strategies in conversation, left notes in his study, sat with him over maps, and talked through logistics the way a person who genuinely loves someone talks through anything, freely, without keeping score. Donald had accepted her, helped the way a man accepts a good meal, with pleasure, without needing to know who cooked it. The first time she understood what was happening was 18 months into the marriage. Donald had been called before the regional council to defend a territorial dispute claim. The case was complicated. It involved overlapping land grants, historical precedent, and a piece of surveying work that had been done incorrectly 40 years earlier and never corrected. Donald had come to her at midnight, visibly shaken, and dropped a pile of documents on her desk without a word of greeting. "I need this untangled," he said. "Council meeting is in 3 days." She untangled it. It took her 41 hours of work spread across those 3 days. She found the original surveying error, traced its effect through 4 decades of subsequent land decisions, and built a legal argument clean enough to present to the council. Donald won the case. He was praised for his meticulous preparation and his surprising depth of legal reasoning. When he returned home that evening, he poured himself a glass of celebratory brandy, toasted the room in general, and said nothing to Susan beyond a brief nod as he passed her in the corridor. She sat at her desk that night, for a long time without working. She was not angry yet. Anger would come later. What she felt that night was something quieter and more dangerous, clarity. She understood, in that moment, that she had a choice. She could make noise about what had happened. She could demand acknowledgement. She could refuse to help again. Or she could continue, but differently. She could be useful in a way that was entirely on her own terms, that built something for herself even as it appeared to be building something for Donald. She began documenting everything, every analysis, every strategic memo, every piece of work that left her desk. She kept a copy, not hidden frantically, not tucked behind loose bricks. She was more careful than that. She kept duplicates in a system she had designed, cross-referenced and dated, stored in a leather ledger that she maintained with the same precision she brought to everything else. The original documents went to Donald. The record of her authorship stayed with her. It was not, at the time, a plan for escape. It was simply a habit of self-preservation, the instinct of a woman who had grown up watching her own mother's ideas absorbed into her father's business decisions without attribution, and who had decided, somewhere around the age of 14, that the solution to invisibility was documentation. You cannot argue with a date stamp. You cannot dispute a draft in a handwriting that is not yours. For 4 years, she built a record. For 4 years, she told herself that Donald was ambitious, but not malicious, that the arrangement was uncomfortable but survivable, that someday the balance would shift. Then came the conversation she was never supposed to hear. The morning Susan overheard the plan was a Wednesday. She remembered it was a Wednesday because she had spent the earlier part of the morning reviewing the trade route proposal that Reuben Gerke had submitted to Donald the previous week. A solid piece of work from Reuben, she had thought, though it had 2 structural gaps that would cause problems when it reached the council. She had written her corrections in pencil in the margins, added 3 paragraphs of additional analysis, and was preparing to transcribe the whole thing in ink when she realized she had run out of black ink and would need to retrieve more from the supply cupboard on the ground floor. The supply cupboard was at the end of the west corridor, not far from Donald's private sitting room. The sitting room door was not fully closed. She was not eavesdropping. She was walking quietly, as she always did, because the floors in the west wing were old, and certain boards announced themselves at high volume if you did not know where to step, and she had learned the quiet path the way you learn anything you have to navigate every day. She heard Donald's voice first. He was speaking in the low, unhurried tone he used when he was not performing, not addressing a room, not impressing a guest, simply talking. "Felix says it can be arranged within the month." "Dr. Felix." Susan's steps slowed without her deciding to slow them. Martha's voice. "And it will hold?" "Legally, it will hold," Donald said. "He has done it before." The woman presents as anxious. She is clearly obsessive about how she works. Stays up half the night, covers paper with notes, barely eats when she is in the middle of something. Felix can write a credible report. Nervous disorder. Instability. A woman of that temperament poses a risk to herself. A pause. The sound of something being set on a table. A cup. Susan thought. A teacup. Martha. And the title? An institutionalization is not a divorce. The marriage remains. The estate remains. I retain full authority. Donald paused. She simply stops being inconvenient. Susan stood in the corridor. She did not drop the empty ink bottle she was holding. She did not make a sound. She did not press her back against the wall in the theatrical way of someone discovering a terrible thing in a story. She simply stood and breathed and listened to the remaining 30 seconds of the conversation with the same focused stillness she brought to decoding a cipher. Donald said. "Within the month, Martha. I need you to be patient for a little longer." Martha said, "I have been patient for 14 months. Donald said lower, "I know, and I am grateful." Susan turned, walked back to the staircase, climbed to the third floor, sat down at her desk, and stared at the wall for 11 minutes. Then she picked up her pen, not to write the trade route analysis. Not yet. She wrote, in small and careful letters at the top of a clean page, what I know, what I have, what I need, what I do. The moral of what Susan had just discovered is not simply that her husband was cruel. Cruelty is obvious. The subtler lesson is this: institutions, medical, legal, social, have always been available as tools against people with less power, and they are most dangerous when they are used not by strangers, but by people who are trusted. Dr. Felix was a respected physician. Donald was a respected duke. Their plan did not rely on violence. It relied on paperwork, on professional authority, on the fact that a woman described as unstable by two men with titles would find it extraordinarily difficult to dispute the description. Susan had studied law, informally and privately, for 3 years. She knew how these cases proceeded. She knew what documentation could be produced, and what documentation could counter it. She also knew, now, that she had approximately 3 to 4 weeks. She began to plan. A person planning something serious does not look, from the outside, like a person planning something serious. That is the first requirement. Susan understood this. She had spent 6 years studying the way powerful men move through rooms confidently, without urgency, without the slightly too controlled expression of someone who is managing something internally. She had learned, by long observation, that real power rarely announces itself. It arrives. She continued her work as normal. She delivered her analysis of Reuben's trade route proposal on Thursday morning, slipping beneath Donald's study door as always, without comment. She ate at the table. She was polite to the housekeeper. She attended the small afternoon gathering that Donald hosted for 3 neighboring families on Saturday, sat quietly, said little, and smiled at appropriate moments. She was completely, deliberately, unremarkably present, while being, in every private moment, entirely elsewhere. The first thing she needed was to confirm what was in Donald's safe. She already knew the safe existed. She had watched the portrait of Donald's late father in the study swing outward on its hinge the morning a courier had delivered a sealed document 3 years ago, and Donald had not noticed her passing in the corridor behind him. She had filed that knowledge in the same place she filed everything, carefully, without reaction, for later. The second thing she needed was the ledger. Her ledger was the one she had been building for 4 years. It was already prepared. She needed only to consolidate it, add the most recent materials, and wrap it in the oilskin she kept in the bottom of the cedar chest for weather protection of important papers. The third thing she needed was a way through the eastern gate without triggering the guard rotation. This was, potentially, the simplest of the 3 problems, because she had designed the eastern gate's locking mechanism. For years ago, Donald had complained that the old gate required 2 guards to open at night, one to hold the lantern, one to work the mechanism, and he had asked, with his customary lack of interest in the process, only that she sort it out. She had redesigned the entire mechanism, making it operable by a single person from the inside. She had built into it a secondary release of a small, specific sequence of movements on the 3rd bolt that she had never documented anywhere, not out of deliberate scheming at the time, simply because she always built a secondary system into anything mechanical she designed. In case of emergency, she had not, at the time, imagined this particular emergency. But here it was. The one variable she could not control was Mr. Edward. Thomas Edward was Donald's estate solicitor, a dry, precise man in his late 50s, who had managed the Harrington estate's legal affairs for over 2 decades. He had small, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the careful posture of someone who had spent a career learning to reveal nothing. Susan did not know what Mr. Edward knew, or how much, or whether he would be a problem. She found out 9 days before the ball. She had been in the estate library on the ground floor, retrieving a volume on regional boundary law not for Donald, for herself, and Mr. Edward had come in to return a document to the shelf. He had seen her. He had paused. And then he had done something she had not expected. He had walked to the far side of the table, opened the document he was returning, and without looking at her directly said, "The Third Amendment to the Estate Charter, the one that specifies original authorship rights over materials produced within the estate by any party, including spouses." He set the document on the shelf. "I reviewed it this week, as part of a routine audit." A pause. "It was last reviewed 3 years ago. The language is quite specific." He turned and walked to the door. Before he left, "It is a cold month, Your Grace. I would dress warmly if going out in the evenings." He left. Susan sat with the Boundary Law volume open in her lap and looked at the shelf where he had placed the charter document and understood, very precisely, what Thomas Edward had just told her without saying a single incriminating word. He knew, and he was not going to stop her. She allowed herself, for exactly 1 moment, to feel the full weight of what that meant. One ally is quiet, careful, unofficial, but real. Then she went back to her planning. The winter ball at Harrington Manor was Donald's grandest event of the year. He had held it every January for the past 5 years, and it had become, in the way of things that powerful men repeat until repetition confers significance, a genuine social occasion, one that magistrates requested invitations to, that visiting dignitaries rearranged schedules to attend, that was written about in the county correspondence as evidence of the Duke's largesse and cultural refinement. It was, Susan had always thought privately, an extraordinary amount of work for a party. She had organized the first 3, before Donald had decided that event planning was beneath the Duchess and hired a coordinator. The coordinator had made 3 significant logistical errors in the 4th ball and been quietly replaced. Donald had not, at any point, mentioned that the first 3 had run without a single problem. Tonight, the manor was transformed. Every chandelier blazed. The ground floor had been opened fully. The connecting doors between the parlor, the ballroom, and the east drawing room all folded back to create one long, glittering space through which 200 guests moved in their finest winter clothes, trailing perfume and conversation. The string quartet was positioned in the far corner of the ballroom, and they played with the particular energy of musicians who were being paid well and were also genuinely enjoying themselves, which produces a sound that is noticeably different from musicians who are only being paid well. Donald was in his element. He wore a dark coat with silver buttons, and his metal's never a subtle man, and he moved through his guests the way a man moves through a room he considers entirely his own, greeting, laughing, listening briefly, and then redirecting conversations toward himself with such practiced ease that people were charmed by it rather than annoyed. Martha was there. Of course she was there. She had arrived early, before most of the guests, and she wore the crimson again. She stood near Donald, but not beside him. They had developed a social choreography that maintained what they presumably considered plausible deniability, and which fooled, Susan estimated, approximately no one. Reuben Gerke arrived at 7:30 and stationed himself, with quiet efficiency, near the entrance to the east corridor, where he had a clear sight line to both the main room and the staircase. He had a glass of something he was not drinking. He spent a great deal of time looking at things. Susan descended the staircase at 7:20. She wore navy, which was not remarkable. Her hair was dressed simply, which was not remarkable. She smiled at the guests near the foot of the stairs, greeted Magistrate Harold Reed and Catherine with the warmth that 6 years of social practice had made genuine looking even when it was not, and moved into the party with exactly the same unassuming grace she always brought to these evenings. She did not look at Donald. She did not look at Martha. She did not look at the staircase she planned to use in approximately 90 minutes. She talked to Catherine Reed for 20 minutes, which she would have done on any other evening. She accepted a glass of champagne and held it for 40 minutes without finishing it, which she also did on any other evening. She laughed at the magistrate's somewhat labored joke about the weather, because the magistrate was fundamentally a decent man who tried hard. At 8:45, she excused herself from the group near the east drawing-room fireplace with a comment about a headache barely worth mentioning, just a slight one. She would return shortly, and she walked, without hurrying, through the connecting doorway, down the short passage, and up the servants' stair on the far side of the east wing. No one followed her. No one noticed she had gone. This, she had understood for a long time, was the particular freedom that comes with being overlooked. When you are not truly seen, you are also not truly watched. Donald's private study was on the second floor, at the end of the east corridor, behind a door that locked from the outside with a key that only Donald was supposed to carry. Susan had made a copy of the key 14 months ago, not as part of a plan, not with any specific intention. She had simply noticed, one morning, that Donald had left his key ring on the corner of his desk while he bathed, and she had thought with the calm foresight of a woman who had been paying attention for 4 years that it was the kind of thing worth having. She pressed the key into the lock now. The corridor was empty. Below her, she could hear the music from the quartet and the general warm murmur of 200 people enjoying themselves. The sounds made the second floor feel very far away. The study door opened. The room smelled of old wood, leather, and the particular staleness of a space that is kept very clean but not frequently aired. A single lamp burned low on the desk. Donald always kept a lamp burning, even when he was not in the room, because he had read somewhere once that candlelight was better for books and had extended the principle to oil lamps without much scrutiny. Susan crossed to the portrait. It hung on the far wall. Donald's father, in the formal style of 25 years ago, wearing an expression that managed to be both severe and slightly startled, as if the painter had caught him mid-thought about something unpleasant. The portrait was fixed to the wall by a hinge on the left side. She had not been able to see this when she watched Donald open it from the corridor years ago, but she had worked out the mechanics from the visible evidence afterward, the same way she worked out most things. She ran her fingers along the right side of the frame until she found the small, smooth depression barely larger than a thumbnail near the bottom corner. She pressed it. The portrait swung smoothly outward. The safe behind it was a Harrington double-lock model, which had been considered extremely secure approximately 15 years ago and was now, in Susan's estimation, somewhat less so, because she had spent 3 weeks the previous winter reading everything she could find on lock mechanics, initially because Donald had asked her to assess whether the estate's locksmith was overcharging for maintenance, and she had, as usual, gone somewhat further than the assignment required. She knew the combination because she had watched Donald open it once, from the correct angle, on an evening he had forgotten she was in the room. He forgot she was in a great many rooms. She had stopped counting the times this had proved useful. The safe opened on the second attempt. Her hands were very steady. She had noticed, coming up the stairs, that her hands were steadier than she had expected them to be, and she had decided not to think about why that was, and simply to be grateful for it. Inside the safe were 3 sealed envelopes, a small box that likely contained jewelry of some sentimental value, several documents she recognized as estate deeds, and there a leather folder tied with a dark ribbon. She opened the folder. Inside were the originals of 12 documents, the 12 most consequential political strategies that had made Donald's reputation over the past 4 years. She recognized each one the way you recognize your own handwriting, the specific turn of a letter, the particular way she formed her sevens, the pencil marginal notes she had made that someone had then erased before the final copies were produced. Someone, Donald, or more likely a secretary acting under instruction. He had kept them. That surprised her briefly. Then it did not. Donald kept things that proved power. He simply assumed that his name on the strategy equaled authorship, the same way a man assumes that signing a letter means he wrote it. She removed the documents from the folder. From inside her cloak, she withdrew the dummy folder. She had prepared 12 pages of dense, convincing-looking text that she had composed 2 nights ago specifically to mimic the appearance of strategic documents at a glance, the kind of thing that would pass casual inspection in a dark room but would prove meaningless to anyone who read it carefully. She placed the dummy documents in the leather folder, retied the ribbon exactly as it had been, and returned the folder to the safe. She placed the real documents inside her cloak, beside the ledger. She locked the safe. She pressed the portrait back into place. She checked the room lamp in the same position, nothing out of place. Door relocked behind her. She walked back down the east corridor, descended the servant's stair, and entered the ground floor, through the kitchen passage. No one saw her. She did not go back to the party. She went to the cloakroom near the east entry, retrieved the dark outer cloak she had placed there earlier that afternoon, and put it on over her dress. She tied the oilskin-wrapped ledger and documents securely against her body. Then she stepped out of the east entry into the rain. The weather, for once, was useful. The eastern gate was 40 yards from the Manor's east entry door, across the service courtyard, past the woodshed, and along a short stone path that the gardeners used for deliveries. 2 guards were posted at the main gate on the Manor's south front. One guard circulated on a rotating path that took him from the south gate around the west garden and back, a rotation that took 11 minutes and 20 seconds, which Susan knew because she had timed it on 3 separate evenings over the past month, standing at the 3rd-floor window with a small pocket watch, the same way she timed everything she needed to understand. The eastern gate had no posted guard. It was considered secure enough on its own, given the lock mechanism. No one considered the possibility that the person who designed the mechanism might also know how to open it without the key. Susan crossed the service courtyard in the rain, keeping close to the woodshed wall, where the overhang gave a thin strip of shelter and the shadow was heaviest. She was not running. Running attracts attention and slows you down when the ground is wet. She walked with the specific, unhurried purpose of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be, in case anyone was watching from a window. She reached the eastern gate. The 3rd bolt, the secondary release she had built in, required a very specific motion. Up, slightly left, then firm pressure directly inward, while simultaneously releasing the upper bolt. Not complicated, but unintuitive enough that no one would find it by accident. Her hands were still steady. The gate opened. She walked through it. She pulled it closed behind her. The latch caught. She was on the lane beyond the estate wall, and the rain was heavier out here without the walls to break the wind, and it didn't matter at all. She walked 400 yards down the lane to where a covered hired coach was waiting, arranged 2 weeks ago through a third party who had no connection to Harrington Manor and no reason to mention it to anyone. She got in. She did not look back. The driver took her to the county solicitor's office in the neighboring town, not Thomas Edwards' office, but a second solicitor she had engaged in writing 3 weeks prior under her maiden name, Susan Ferris, which was still her legal name in all matters not specifically encompassed by the marriage contract, a detail she had confirmed in the estate library using the boundary law volume she had retrieved the day Mr. Edward left his quiet, oblique message. The solicitor's name was James Whitfield. He was young, ambitious, and had a particular professional hunger for the kind of case that makes careers. She had explained everything to him in writing. He had written back one line, "I will be ready." He was ready. They worked through the night. By morning, every relevant document was notarized, recorded, and filed. The original strategies, with their dates and Susan's handwriting and the erased marginal notes still faintly visible on 3 of the 12 pages erased in pencil, which can be softened but not fully removed, were submitted as evidence to the Regional Legal Archive. The estate charter amendment, the one Mr. Edward had so carefully replaced on the shelf, was cited chapter and verse. At Harrington Manor, Donald did not notice Susan was gone until nearly 10 o'clock the following morning. He had assumed she had gone to bed early, as she sometimes did after parties. He had not checked. He did not check these things. It was Martha who first sensed that something was wrong, not because she was perceptive about Susan specifically, but because Martha was perceptive about threats in general, and something about the morning felt off in a way she could not locate. Then Donald went to his study. He was there for approximately 4 minutes before he came back out, and his face was a color Martha had never seen on it before. Not quite white, not quite gray, the color of a man whose understanding of his own situation has just undergone a catastrophic revision. "She took it," he said. "Martha, what?" "All of it." He did not mean the jewelry, which he checked next and found untouched. He meant the documents. He meant, though he could not yet fully articulate this to himself, the entire foundation of his political reputation. Reuben Gerke was informed at midday that the Duke required an urgent meeting. Reuben arrived, sat down, and listened to Donald's disjointed account of the previous night with the careful, measuring expression he always wore. When Donald finished, Reuben was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your Grace, the Aldenmore dispatch, the Eastern Garrison reinforcement decision, the barrack trade route, were any of those?" He paused. "Were those strategies yours, originally?" Donald said nothing. Reuben Gerke had, in fact, been doing arithmetic for 3 months. He had begun to notice very quietly, to himself, that after the Barrack route proposal had gone to Donald for review, it had come back with corrections in a different hand. He had noticed that the tactical language in Donald's written responses to military questions was inconsistent in style from letter to letter, as if different people were producing different answers. He had not known what to make of this. Now he was beginning to. He left the meeting and went directly to send a private communication to Magistrate Harold Reed. The story broke, as stories of this kind always break, not through an official announcement but through the slow, relentless movement of information through social networks. Catherine Reed, who had watched Susan's face at that dinner 6 months ago and remembered what she had seen, not sadness, but calculation, received a note from Susan through James Whitfield's office. The note was factual, brief, and enclosed 3 pages of corroborating documents. Catherine read it twice. Then she paid 12 social calls in 4 days, as she normally did, and in each call she mentioned, as one mentioned something of casual interest, that there were some rather extraordinary questions being raised about the authorship of the Duke of Harrington's political work, and that a legal process was underway. Catherine Reed was, in aristocratic society, the kind of woman whose social standing is so unassailable that the things she says in drawing rooms become, within 48 hours, the things everyone is repeating. She had cultivated this status carefully over 30 years, and she deployed it now with the precision of someone who has been waiting a long time for a genuinely worthwhile cause. The magistrate opened a formal inquiry. Dr. Felix was interviewed within the week. His proposed medical report on Susan, half drafted, as it turned out, already on his desk, was entered into evidence. It documented his intention to certify Susan as mentally unstable. It was dated. It was in his handwriting. It was, for a physician, a catastrophically incriminating document to have left lying around, but Dr. Felix had not expected to need to worry about it, because he had not expected Susan to leave. He lost his medical certification 3 weeks after the inquiry opened. Martha Gracia left Harrington County before the worst of the public discussion arrived, a decision that was widely interpreted, correctly, as the decision of someone who knew more than she wanted to be questioned about. She did not escape the questions. They found her through the legal process, which does not care much whether a person has relocated. Her involvement in the institutionalization plan was documented in Donald's own words. The conversation Susan had heard through the sitting room door, which she had written down in full within an hour of hearing it, dated and witnessed later by James Whitfield as a contemporaneous account. Donald's title was reviewed by the regional authority, a duke whose political position was built on misappropriated intellectual work, who had conspired with a physician to have his wife wrongfully institutionalized, who had committed what the charter amendment specified as fraud against an estate contributor. This was not, the regional authority concluded, a duke who could remain in his position without resolution. His title was not immediately stripped. These processes take time, but his political authority was suspended pending the full inquiry, which meant that every committee he chaired, every military decision he signed off on, every treaty bearing his seal was now under review. Reuben Gerke was appointed acting military advisor during the transition. He was, if not quite glad about the circumstances, deeply relieved to finally understand them. Susan Ferris gave her full testimony before the regional council on a Thursday in late February. She wore dark blue. Her hair was simply dressed. She sat in the chair they directed her to, arranged her papers on the table in front of her, and then she looked around the room at the council members, at Magistrate Reed, at James Whitfield seated to her left, at the gallery of observers permitted to attend, and she was calm. She had expected to be nervous. She had prepared for nervousness the way she prepared for everything, methodically, working through it on paper, identifying the sources of it, and addressing them one by one. But sitting in the council chamber, she found that the nervousness did not appear. What appeared instead was something she had not felt in a very long time: readiness. She spoke for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She presented the original documents, the ledger, the dated draft analyses, the erased marginal notes on the 12 recovered strategies, the estate charter amendment, and the contemporaneous written account of the institutionalization plan. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, because the facts themselves were, she knew, more compelling than any embellishment she could have added. She answered questions for another 40 minutes. Not once did anyone interrupt her with disbelief. Not once did anyone suggest that the evidence was unclear. The council's lead recorder, a small, sharp woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had held the position for 11 years and was known for recording proceedings with the expressionless efficiency of a machine, paused at one point, partway through Susan's presentation of the Eastern Garrison strategy, and looked up from her notes. She looked at Susan directly. Then she looked back down and wrote something in her record that was not part of the official transcript. What she wrote, in the margin of her private notes, she wrote all of it. 3 months after the testimony, the Regional Council formally recognized Susan Ferris as the originating intellectual author of 17 documented political strategies and 8 military analyses produced under the Harrington estate seal over 6 years. They offered her because they did not quite know what else to do with a woman of her capability, and because several of them had the private, somewhat uncomfortable sense that they were attempting to partially correct something that could not be fully corrected, a formal advisory position with the Regional Council, under her own name, with a title of her own choosing. She chose Strategic Council, not the Duchess, not Lady, not any title that belonged to someone else's world, her own. Donald Harrington watched all of this from the increasingly small position that remained to him. His estate was under review. His political authority was suspended. The servants had begun giving notice, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in the polite and efficient way of people who understand which way the situation is moving and are making sensible decisions accordingly. The ballroom, which had blazed so brilliantly at the January ball, was quiet and dark. He had, by early spring, a great deal of time to sit in rooms he used to pass through quickly. And in those rooms, in the particular silence that comes when all the performing is over, he sat with something that had no title and required no legal proceeding. The plain, private knowledge that for 6 years, the most impressive thing about him had been her. Whether that knowledge changed him, no one who had known him before believed it would, but it settled on him like the weather, heavy, unignorable, his to carry now without her. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? If this story moves something in you, we want to know. Please subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. You have no idea how far your one comment travels. Someone somewhere is going to discover this story because you showed up. That's the kind of thing that keeps us going. Thank you for being part of this journey. Truly. OUTRO. There is something worth saying about what Susan Ferris did and what she did not do. She did not burn the house down. She did not make scenes. She did not, at any point, lose herself in the way that the people underestimating her might have expected her to. She did something harder. She waited until she had everything she needed. She built the case while still inside the situation. She left at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right things, through a door she had quietly prepared years before she knew she would need it. There is an educational truth buried in this story, and it is this: documentation is not paranoia. Keeping records of your own work, your ideas, your contributions, the dates and details of what you have produced is not pessimism. It is self-respect made practical. There are women in workplaces, in partnerships, in institutions right now whose work is being taken without credit, whose intelligence is being quietly borrowed and publicly attributed to someone else. The lesson Susan's story offers is not only about escaping, it is about the habit of keeping the proof, even when you hope you will never need it. And the second truth: the most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest one. It is usually the one who has been paying attention. Susan Ferris was Strategic Counsel to the Regional Council for 11 years. Her work was published under her name. She had a desk she was allowed to tell people about. And every morning, she arrived at that desk, opened her journal, wrote the date, and began the work, not because anyone expected it of her, not to impress anyone, not as proof of anything, simply because she loved it. She had always loved it. That part had never been in question. Some people do not lose because they are weak. They lose because they stayed too long. And some people do not win by fighting. They win by leaving at exactly the right time, with exactly the right proof, through a door they built themselves. The end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.